So we are joined by Frederick Bronchick, founder at Polar Signals, previously with Red Hat and CoreOS. You might know Frederick from his work as a maintainer of Prometheus and Thanos. He's also the tech lead for SIG instrumentation in the Kubernetes project. So welcome, Frederick. Gordon Radline is an engineering manager at Facebook. There was Gordon. He is supporting observability and infrastructure at Facebook, previously at Etsy and an SRE at Google. Gordon has worked at a number of companies, both big and small, in a variety of domains. And then we have Liz Fong Jones, who is a principal developer advocate at Honeycomb. She's a member of my team. I absolutely love her. You will too. You probably know her from her advocacy work or from a variety of other places. She's a co-author of the upcoming O'Reilly Observability Engineering book, along with me and with Charity Majors. So welcome, Liz. And then finally, this panel is being moderated by Rag Srinivas, lead architect at InfoQ, where he focuses on Kubernetes, open source, and DevOps. With that, I'll hand it over to Rags.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Hopefully you guys were, at the earlier panel. So we're not going to talk too much about Donametrics because I think that was being that there. But this panel is really about basics to advanced forensics. We have an August panel, and they're willing to answer just about every question that you have on observability, including what is observability, right? And just want to remind you guys that this is your panel, so it's all going to be based on the questions that you ask on Slack. Please, go to this channel on Slack. And I will try to kind of moderate those questions and feed it to the right panelist. But if you want a certain panelist, just indicate your preference as well. With that said, I really want to thank everybody, and especially the panelists. And before we dive into the audience questions, I'd like to kind of start by asking each of you, what was your first experience with observability, whether it was a pleasant experience, nightmarish experience, or whatever. So use that to introduce yourself and kind of, build that bridge with the panel, with the audience, so that they can ask you the right question. So let's go with Frederick.
Yeah, hey, so I think you started with an interesting question there, which is how do we even define observability? Because I guess we need to sort of do that before we can talk about what my first experience is. And really, I think there are a lot of definitions out there, but for me, observability is sort of anything that allows me to understand the operational aspects of my software better, right? And so that's actually a very broad definition, but if we take that, I guess it must be somewhere around 2002 or something, Debian 2, I was using logs to understand my software better. But I guess if we talk about more what we would think of as let's call it the modern era of observability, that was probably around 2014 when I first started using kind of time series for alerting purposes. And I think that was, for myself, was kind of where an evolution happened, where Prometheus was open sourced. And for me, I felt like there was a new beginning where we weren't doing Nagios checks anymore, but we were actually gaining much more deeper insight. And ever since, the community has really developed quite drastically, right? That we can understand our systems better than ever before. But I guess that's kind of my story, and I don't want to take everybody's time.
Let's move on to Gordon.
Sure. I'm going to throw back. I mean, I have a similar kind of understanding of what observability is. Something, it is a property of a system that tells you how well you can kind of understand its state by looking at it. And so I'll take it way back to when I was like first learning to program, and I wrote a little Python script and wrote my code, went to the command line, hit enter, and then nothing happened. It just went to the next line. I was like, oh, did something happen? And that's when I learned about the utility of print statements and getting insight into like what is actually happening in a running program. And I'd say that my journey kind of started there. Since then, it's just been kind of learning new tools that provide better observability and then running into the limits of those tools and looking around to see what's next.
All right. Last but not least, Liz Fong.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to echo what Frederick said, which is that this idea of let's see this turbulent behavior in production, let's see what unexpected things users are going to do on my systems. That was my first job. I was working as a technical support engineer on a massively multiplayer online game, Puzzle Pirates, and players were doing all kinds of weird botting activities, cheating activities, and those would show telltale fingerprints in the logs. But I think really the modern age of observability for me started with the Monarch monitoring system at Google. It was my first exposure to really measuring and understanding production systems by using config as code rather than just writing a bunch of kind of hacked together, scripts. It was actually like, let's properly do this with proper instrumentation and proper query language.
Perfect. I just realized we don't have any questions on the Slack panel, and there may be a little bit of confusion with the previous panel and this panel. So, if you have a question for this panel, just prefix it with forensics. Okay. So with that said, in the spirit of kind of crawl, walk, run, right? It seems like observability covers so many aspects, right? It could be as simple as like what Gordon said, just like putting print statements to, doing something a lot more with OpenTelemetry collectors and so on. For somebody who's kind of relatively new to this journey, where do you recommend starting? And let's go, kind of reverse this time. Start with Liz Fong.
Yeah, I think that there are a variety of ways to start these days, but I think the primary aim should be understanding user behavior. That you can always drill down and add more granular statements later, but if you're not capturing the traffic coming into your application or coming through your load balancer, then you have no hope of understanding what's happening under the hood. You've got nothing to tie it to. So that's kind of why I advocate this kind of tracing-based approach, where you start by tracing the broadest request at ingress, and then you add in more instrumentation as you go. That being said, I'm not super picky that it has to be a trace. I feel that there are a variety of ways to do it as long as it's extensible, as long as you're not going to like silo yourself into a place where you can no longer add telemetry and instrumentation because there's nowhere to attach it to.
Gordon, you want to add something?
Sure. I think it's kind of bringing people into the world of observability and the tools can be tricky because there's a lot of tooling now. There's the ecosystem has broadened dramatically, over the past number of years, and people can get overwhelmed fairly easily. And I think it's one of these things that it's similar to an analogy might be like test-driven development, right? Where the right thing to do is to like write the tests, and that's good, and people say you should do that, but like in practice, people just like write their code and then maybe bolt on some tests if somebody calls them out on it. I just try to think about it through the lens of like not overwhelming people who are new to this space with kind of like the most advanced concepts and things like that. And to Liz's point is like capturing those user flows, and how you do that, will kind of depend on the kind of tooling that you have available to you. And it's really just starting to kind of like bootstrap that cycle, because once people start to get that feedback, to see those charts move, to understand those request flows and see these events in their logs that are interesting, that kind of just bootstraps that cycle, and you want more of it, right? You want more, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Well, what happened here? And then you realize you can't answer it, and then you start thinking more about it. So I think it's like use whatever tools you have available and just start to capture those kind of critical flows and ask questions and bootstrap that cycle.
Friedrich, you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I can, without adding too many more aspects, maybe I can bring in an actual example. I maintain a project that kind of automatically sets up an entire observability stack on Kubernetes. And exactly what the other panelists have just said happens here, where people install this and they're immediately overwhelmed with the amount of information available. And so I can only kind of repeat what Liz said. Be really intentional about the thing that you're trying to do, and start at kind of the ingress level. That tends to be where you already get so much insight, maybe enough insight, right? We also often say that like that's where you want to define your SLOs. Essentially, that's where most of your users actually interact with your service, right? So I completely agree with that, and not only on a technical, from a technical perspective, but it's also from kind of a cultural, organizational perspective. Because if you buy a product or install a system that gathers a lot of data, that tends to also quickly add up in terms of cost of this system, right? And if you can kind of gradually prove the worth of the system and grow it that way, I think you'll be much more successful than kind of creating a really huge bill right away. Even though it's probably worth it, it's harder to sell rather than kind of gradually showing this is actually improving our reliability and our understanding of our system, rather than going all out right away.
Perfect. We have a question from Robert Boothby, and I think that's being answered by James Governor as well. But I think this is especially relevant to this panel. What is the difference between observability in a traditional data center hosted context and in a cloud native context? Personally, I'd use the same tools, but there may be more. So I guess what are the tools for the trade for a cloud native developer who wants to implement observability? Let's start with Gordon this time.
Sure. I think Liz will have some good insights here, but I'll kind of tell you, I guess, kind of my perspective, which is at a high level. I mean, I don't think there's that much of a difference in that. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is have insights into kind of all aspects of your system, so you can answer whatever questions you need to answer at the time you need to answer them, right? And if you control a data center, then that might even get into, is there rack maintenance happening in the cluster where the set of servers live that is currently serving this workload that's having problems, right? Now, if you're in kind of the cloud, you're probably not looking at that level, but you probably want to know if there's issues happening in the zone or region that you're in, right? It's a similar thing. And so it's these levels of abstraction go up, but at the end of the day, you want to get insight kind of as deep as you can all the way through your system down to kind of the core primitives of your infrastructure.
I love that answer, Gordon, because I think it encapsulates this idea of what is cloud native, right? Does cloud native mean that you are using a modern, Kubernetes or like microservices architecture, or does it mean the difference between owning your infrastructure soup to nuts versus using a cloud provider? And I think those are two different considerations, right? Facebook, I would argue, is cloud native in terms of having many microservices, but it's not cloud native in terms of Facebook runs its own data centers, right? Whereas at Honeycomb, we trust AWS to run our infra, right? That means that we need to measure and instrument everything that's flowing outbound to AWS so that we can communicate clearly with AWS across that boundary, right? So I think that kind of influences your technical choices of what do you instrument, what do you measure, how deeply does it integrate with your software stack?
Yeah, I think one additional thing that I would add to that is, if you actually own the data center, there are some things that you just can't fundamentally rely on, right? Like if you're entirely on a cloud, you can rely on like distributed like data storage. You can rely on persistent volumes and stuff like that, right? Like if you don't have that, like there are some fundamental assumptions that you can't make about your infrastructure. And like this is where Prometheus, for example, came from, like where you really don't want a distributed system is when you're running this infrastructure and there's nothing else but the bare metal that you can rely on. And when you go further up the stack, I totally understand how using a distributed monitoring system can make sense, but it's kind of all layers, right? And so, yeah.
Great. I know there's another question on how do you scale observability, but let's jump to a little bit more kind of technical question, which is really about, I often have trouble with, and this came from Ryan Brown, thanks Ryan. I often have trouble with querying to find the specific query I'm looking for. Sometimes due to not knowing what some other developers named a trace or what attributes it has, right? Are there any guidelines or tips on the naming or ease of querying for adding a trace or span or attribute to an application? I guess it goes
Exemplars,
back
exemplars. I've been talking about this for years, like even before I came to Honeycomb, like I was at Google, and this was one of the things that changed my mind about the value of tracing. Before exemplars, I was a metrics purist. I was like, Monarch is the way, like, let's have many, many time series. These traces are so hard to access. Why would I even bother? And being able to click on a spot in the heat map that showed me an example trace that exemplified that behavior I was looking for, that changed my mind. Like it fundamentally changed something in me. And now I want to bring that to everyone, regardless of whether they're using, Prometheus and Jaeger or whether they're using Honeycomb. Like, that fundamentally changes things. I see Frederick nodding too.
Yes, I'm very excited.
Kind of a maybe a dumb question here. Is exemplars applicable across the board, or is it only relevant in the context of OpenTelemetry?
I think they're a general concept. I think OpenTelemetry will probably make them quite a lot more accessible, just because of that kind of intertwinement, I guess if that's a word, of like technologies, right? The Prometheus client libraries have support for it, but you kind of need to wire it up yourself. And so I think the kind of accessibility is going to vastly increase.
Yeah, you don't have to have OpenTelemetry, right? We did it at Google. I presume that Gordon's team is thinking about it at Facebook, right? Like these are the kinds of things that are easier to do if you have that shared tagging and context propagation mechanism, which is what OpenTelemetry fundamentally is, right? It's this backbone on which you build all the rest of your telemetry.
Yeah, I think like one point I want to flag here is just like when you think about exemplars, like what we're really talking about is like discovery. Right? Like, how do you make it really easy for people to find what they're looking for? There's systems that will kind of log trace IDs in your logs. So if you're looking at logs, you might be able to click click through and kind of load up a trace of interest. But it's very much on the tooling. And you need to, ideally you're using or can acquire or build tools that make it easy to discover these things, because I think especially when it comes to tracing, like discovery is the most important thing, because like if you don't have discovery, like people aren't just gonna go to your separate application and start randomly iterating through different kind of permutations of queries to see if they can maybe find.
That's the worst, right? Like the random clicking, the frustration. You can see it in users like query users, and they're just like, "Oh, I give up."
Yeah.
So I think Ryan had a follow-up here, which is like, so instead of querying trace with X and Y, look for a trace that fails, and then click around to find an example and narrow from there. Is that kind of the way you would do it?
You should be able to do both, right? I think that both is valid. You should be able to do both.
Yeah.
And the way that you get to, trace with X and Y is with sufficiently advanced trace querying and also consistent naming schemes, right? Schemas are super, super important for making sure, is it app.error? Is it app.error, right?
Yep. And naming is hard.
Yeah, I think there were multiple attempts at like namespacing for observability data. I don't think there's a standard that has necessarily established itself, but I know there are a lot of people also wanting to have like standardized metrics for HTTP, for gRPC, for like things that are common in the industry, and I think that would also help in terms of discovery.
Perfect. The next question again from Kyle Galloway, am I saying it right? Is once observability is in a company's culture, and especially, let's talk cloud native here, how do you scale? Who wants to take it? I will let one of you pick it. And again, we don't need to be congenial to each other. We can fight a little bit and say, okay.
I can start. So the question, just to repeat it, is like, once a company has observability in its culture, how do you scale? I would kind of say that like once a company has observability in its culture, that will just happen. And I think the really hard part is getting it in the culture, right? Because like typically, if you think about kind of a company that's not tiny, right? You're getting into 50, 100 plus developers. You have different teams that own different things. And the hard part is not saying like, oh, we want to add tracing or we want to like instrument some stuff. But there's like, who's going to do this work? Who's going to own it? Where's it going to live? Oh, there's an existing system that does a similar thing, but not as well. What happens to that? Does it keep running? Do we turn it off? What happens to those people? Like, you get all of these questions, right? And like, it becomes very hard to scale. Like the coordination cost, the organizational coordination cost, often becomes like the limiting factor. And so like an organization that has kind of observability like in its bones is going to prioritize that and find ways to make that work, whatever mechanisms they use. But I think it tends to be really hard when everybody says they want observability, right? But like, is anybody changing their roadmap, right, to get this stuff done, to create the integration that is needed to really make discovery simple so that people that aren't in the weeds on this stuff all day, it gets in front of them and they start using it, right? So I think that is the hard part.
Yeah,
I really love that idea of how do you make it so that people who are not in the weeds in it can use it easily, right? Like at Honeycomb, one of the things that we do is our pull request template has a what is your observability plan, right? Like you fill that out every pull request to explain, like, how am I going to understand where this chain is working, right? So that it's not just the super experts, right? But it's that everyone on the team is practicing this and reinforcing it, and rather than, just the, one logging tool wizard, right? Like if you have the one logging tool wizard, then that's not going to work.
Yeah, I love how that example ties back to scaling it, because clearly you've already implemented the kind of culture, right? And that's how you make it scale. And I think that kind of exactly ties back to Gordon's point that like it scales when you have the culture, not really vice versa.
All right. I think we have time for one last question, and I'm going to pick my question here, which is OpenTelemetry is by far the second most popular project at CNCF, next only to Kubernetes. Is Kubernetes really helping in standardizing the observability efforts, or really adding more complexity? I mean, what is the kind of synergy, if you will, or whatever, between Kubernetes and cloud native observability? Who wants to
pick on my SIG observability person?
Yeah, I don't think Kubernetes is necessarily complicating it. Maybe Kubernetes is complicating it for itself just because of historic things that are already there, that are like widely used, right? I don't think it's complicating it, but I think there's kind of almost a fundamental tension, and sometimes I struggle with this with OpenTelemetry myself. It's very intentional that OpenTelemetry kind of ties all of these things together, but that also brings kind of difficulties with it when you want to use it, right? If you already use a metric system, then switching may make it more difficult, right? And so I'm not sure Kubernetes is making it more difficult for OpenTelemetry than vice versa, right? Or existing legacy, if you want to call it that, making it hard for Kubernetes. Not that there's anything wrong with what Kubernetes does today, but obviously Kubernetes wants to do tracing, and that's been long in the works, and it's happening, but it's difficult to introduce when you have lots of existing processes.
Yeah.
The one thing Kubernetes has done that's really great for OTel is enabling people to run the OTel collector as a sidecar, right? Like without an orchestration platform like Kubernetes, it would be nigh impossible to just standardize and say, you're going to get a collector running on this local port on every process that you run.
Gotcha. Gordon, do you have anything to add, or?
I do not. I think.
Okay. All right. So let's go to final words. Maybe each of you have like 45 seconds. Anything that you want to add. It's perfectly fine to say I just pass. So let's go with Liz.
Yeah, I think that, in keeping with the theme of the panel of going from basics to advanced forensics, right? Like, I would say don't be intimidated by the folks who are doing advanced forensics, right? Like, don't feel like you have to get there or else, right? You can take these baby incremental steps and they'll just free up so much more of your time, right? The easier you make it to investigate production problems, the easier you make it for people to indulge their curiosity about their code and systems, the more that will kind of drive that value. And then over time, you'll work your way towards the advanced setup. So kind of measure the simple stuff and observe the simple stuff and then go from there.
Perfect. Gordon?
I guess on that same note of basic to advanced forensics, I'd just say for folks kind of building the tools to really think about how you take your users from basic to advanced forensics, right? How do they get a simple kind of introduction to the value you can provide, right, with observability, with the data you're collecting, and then how do you use that to bring them into kind of maybe more powerful tooling and maybe more powerful features that can bring them even more value, but require kind of more of their investment to kind of learn and really make use of. And I think thinking about that is really critical to scaling observability at an organization, because I find like a lot of people, especially if they're new to the system or it is a tool amongst all the other tools they're using because they're focused on maybe product development or something like that, you have to show them the value, and you don't do that by like throwing a very complex system in front of their face and say, look how awesome this is.
Yeah, to maybe add, I agree with everything that's already been said, but to maybe add in another point, what I always like to say is kind of look at the tools that you are still using today that aren't automated in any way, right? Like all of the tools that we use and that have been developed today somehow originated in us manually collecting this data, right? And us at Polar Signals, we do continuous profiling, and profiling has been kind of part of the developer's toolbox forever, right? But continuous profiling is sort of the continuation of that, right? No pun intended, where we look at profiling in new and interesting ways to make it even more useful, right? And I think there's so much out there that hasn't even been touched just by looking at the tools that you use to debug incidents that go beyond the tools that you have today. And I think there's so much more value to be created.
Perfect. With that said, I think we will give back like 30 seconds. I really want to thank everybody who attended. I know there are some questions in the queue, including about SQS, incidentally. So please come back on Slack and we will answer those questions. But I really want to thank the panelists. I think it was great. Maybe in the near future, we'll do it in person. That's what I'm looking forward to anyway. But thanks everyone again, and ciao.
Cheers.